My name is Peter Straub. I'm a novelist. My most recent book is called Dark Matter, published by Doubleday, soon to be out. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm here to answer some questions asked by you. So let us begin with the questions. The first one was asked me by E3K, who says this: Can you explain the process you and Stephen King used while collaborating on Talisman/Black House? Did you each write separate portions? Did you discuss plot points with each other, etc.? I've always been intrigued by this. Well, a number of people have been intrigued, and I'm very often asked this, so I believe I know the answer. The process was not the same for those two books, for each of those two books. We began Talisman, which is to say the first one, with a long period of discussion, with sending letters back and forth. This was largely before the invention of email, in the very early 80s. We gradually, through meeting at his house and at mine, once we met in Boston, we cooked up an outline. In fact, we started the outline in my house in Westport. I lived in Westport, Connecticut at that time. I had a very nice office at the top of my house. Steve and I spent days up there, beginning the outline, making notes for the rest of the outline. He left, and I cranked away at that outline until it was about 75 pages long, single-spaced. This didn't strike us as daunting, though it should have. Shortly after that, after we discussed the outline a little more, he came down and stayed with me in Westport, and we wrote the beginning of that book together. That is, side by side. He sat down, he wrote, he stood up, I sat down. Sometimes when he wrote, I stood over his shoulder and contributed suggestions or said words that I wanted him to put in, and the same was true when I sat down. I don't remember actually who wrote the first sentence, though I think it might have been Steve. This was a very comradely process, and it went on for perhaps 50 pages. And after that, he left. And from then on, we just swapped. There were modems, which, as far as I knew, had just been invented. But the modems were like actual telephones. They were actual telephones that came embedded on a kind of a stand. You had a separate phone number for them. And we had floppy disks, but they were like old records. They were like old 78 records, and they were actually floppy. It took the computer forever to copy the document onto this thing. Then you stuck it into this huge slot. The machine made digesting noises and eventually began to send the information. He had a different kind of machine than I had, so the codes for, let's say, paragraphing, italicization, or all these other little embedded codes were different for his computer than for mine. So we had to work out a system to handle that. But we went on rolling along quite happily for a long time, perhaps a year. After about 6 months, we realized that what took 2 pages in the outline was taking like 100 pages of text. So we couldn't possibly do a 75-page outline. We'd have a book the size of my house. So we met in Boston at Thanksgiving, and we had what we call the Thanksgiving putsch, which is we looked at each other and said, okay, let's not do the last half of the book. It was a book about a journey. A boy goes to California from New Hampshire, and then he comes back. Steve said, look, let's just stick him in a limousine and have him ride back. And he said, I know the tone would be, what's that word? He said, oh, valedictory. And I heard music. I thought, I know exactly what you mean. So we plugged along. We did send the boy back in his a limousine driven by a friendly werewolf. And when he came back to New Hampshire was the ending of the book. At that point, I went to Steve King's house in Kezar Lake, Maine, on Kezar Lake, Maine. And he had a separate writing studio alongside his house. And we sat in that office there and wrote the ending in the same way we'd written the beginning. And this time, he had his record, which was a record by a man named Eddie, I want to say Eddie Murphy, but that's not right. A Barbadian musician whose big hit was called Electric Avenue. Oh, I wish I could remember. The first line was "Walk Down to Electric Avenue." Steve loved this song. So he played his, and I had a jazz record, and I played that. And we had this intense experience, which was very, very joyful. We just barreled through 100 pages, I'm pretty sure. And when it was all done, there was this great moment. I'd written the last sentence, and Steve said, "Oh, you know what?" And he sat down and he plugged in a long series of phrases between commas that enhanced that last sentence beautifully and made it gorgeous. I'll tell you, it was hard to drive home from that because it was like leaving the site of some miracle or something. It was a profound experience. Then we didn't do another book for 14 years. When we went to think about Black House, which was Steve's idea, really. He'd asked me considerable time after The Talisman if I was interested in doing another book, and I said, of course I was. This time, we worked initially entirely through emails, and we kind of had a very good notion of what the tone would be and what the basic center of the story would be. That is, this world and the other world, the territories. Jack is a man at the beginning of middle age, and a villain based on one of the most fantastic villains in American history, Albert Fish, a murderer who wrote a letter to the mother of one of his victims claiming that the mother could be very happy because her child died a virgin. He also put in a lot of horrible stuff about how she tasted. So there's a worthy villain. We spent time at another house that King that was renting at the time in Florida. I think he bought it subsequently, and in that building, we created a kind of map, an outline or a Bible for Black House. We had it pretty clearly worked out, and then we went back to our neutral corners and began the actual work. I do remember that I began that one, and I wrote the first 50 or so pages. Steve made it very clear that he liked those pages a lot, and on we went. We did not write any part of it actually together. Steve wrote the beginning, Steve wrote the ending, and he wrote it brilliantly. I was very moved by that ending. It didn't take as long as the first one, and on the whole, it was a smoother, happier experience. So the first one, as I said, had its moments of joy, but by the time we were doing Black House, we were no longer the testosterone-laden young men who had written Talisman, and so we were easier on each other and easier on ourselves. And I think actually, in a way, we prefer that book. Okay. Question number 2 comes from Dalton MC, who says, as an aspiring novelist myself and about to, hopefully, enter an MFA program, what's your best advice? I've heard one of the hardest things about writing novels is getting your first book published / getting an agent. Any advice for that specifically? Well, we'll see if I have advice for that specifically, and I probably do. But what I want to say first is that is a characteristic and entirely understandable anxiety. It is difficult to get published, especially now. The publishing atmosphere is colder, harder, more heartless, and surely economic than ever before in my experience, for sure. And it could be worse than it was during the Depression, because back in the Depression, at least, there were all these smaller publishing houses that needed product anyhow. They had to have books to publish. Nobody was giving big advances then, so that wasn't an issue. But I think if you were a talented person, you could break through into print, and I think you can now too, for sure. Except it's a lot harder. It's like the film business now. Editors are far happier saying no, because if they say no, they won't get fired, unless the book they say no to goes on to win the Nobel Prize or turn out to be by J.D. Salinger or Vladimir Nabokov or something of that sort. No isn't always safe. I would say, though, that it is a premature anxiety. And the thing to worry about, especially if you're really beginning the way you are, Dalton MC, the best thing to worry about is your writing itself. It's helpful, I'm sure, to go to an MFA program, and most of the younger writers I know have done it or are doing it. When I was beginning, there were MFA programs, but it never occurred to me to try to get into one because I wasn't very interested in them. I thought I could teach it all to myself, and it turned out that yes, I could, as well as I learned it anyhow. The great virtue and the one great advantage, well, there's another one too, but the first great virtue and advantage of MFA programs is that they give you time out from the world. There's nobody pressuring you to get a job, and there's nobody pressuring you to earn a salary or to support anybody else while you're doing it. Everybody understands that you're there to get your feet on the ground as far as your writing is concerned. And in good programs, you have the time to do that writing. The other great advantage is that you make friends. You have a kind of support group that's built in, which may last you the rest of your writing life. At least one of those people should. And nothing more valuable can be imagined, because writing novels is a lonely business, and it makes for an extremely lonely kind of life. You can never share the writing, but the best thing to do in the light of that is to share the experience of it with somebody who knows what that experience is like and understands what your own values and goals are. When it comes time to find an agent or a publisher, there are these books called writers' yearbooks. They come out every year. Most libraries have them. They have lists of agents somewhere in them, I think somewhere near the back. Extensive, lengthy lists of agents. What you should do is go down those lists, make notes, check up on certain people and see who's agenting, also in another search, who's publishing the people you like to read, the people you feel your work is most like. Those are the people that might take an interest in your manuscript. And then what you do, of course, is you send off a query letter for these people and you ask them if they would be interested in reading your work. You don't just send it to them, because that is an intrusion. You want to sound them out first. Of course, the best thing to do is really to work and to read as much as you can. Those are the really two soundest bits of advice anybody could give any young writer. So, as a direct follow through from that, the third question is from Raise78. Could you give us an idea of the writing process, e.g., how many words a day, family, and other interruptions? Do you have an editor? And are you confident when you finish and hand it in, or are you riddled with doubt? Again, there's no fixed answer to this stuff. What one must do if you want to call yourself a writer, or if you want to make a living writing, if you want to support yourself doing that, or have any profound connection to it, is you must simply work. You have to sit down and do that. every day. So my writing process involves getting to my desk, procrastinating for as long as possible on Facebook or Twitter or email, and then finally getting down and doing it, going back to the place where I stopped the previous day and picking up again, and hoping that the world will just fade out so that I can have an immersive experience and surround myself with the materials and characters of the book I'm working on. Of course, one is also involved in all these constant decisions about syntax, about word choice. In a way, I think that keeps it interesting. It means you're never really bored. You have all these decisions to make at every moment, unless some angel has gripped your pen and is busily writing the thing for you. It's a thing that happens every now and again, but can be prayed for, but never planned for. You have to sit there and make those decisions yourself. When I'm rolling along, I try to write at least 5 pages a day. What would that be? 1,500 words, perhaps. I am constantly interrupted. UPS keeps arriving. FedEx keeps showing up. When I had small children, they were always bursting in and brandishing some broken toy, or brandishing a complaint about their sibling. I have a wife. I have a nice house with my office located at the top, kind of a way out of the fray, but one, of course, is drawn into everything that happens. It takes about 15 minutes to return to the level of concentration you're at when you're interrupted. Somebody once said the way to really make sure you ruin a writer's career is to just call him up every 15 minutes, because then the phone will ring and he won't ever get back to work. Yes, of course, I have an editor. It's not always the same editor. I have an excellent editor now, but she's only worked on this one book, A Dark Matter. I've had great editors, very good editors, and only one really bad one. I think I was very lucky, or most editors are pretty good, and I think probably most of them do have something to offer and should certainly be listened to in cooperative and modest fashion. There's no point in being arrogant with your editor. It usually doesn't work. So am I confident when I finish? Yeah, usually. I'm anxious. I want to see what they're going to do, how much they're going to injure my baby, and the fact is they may stick a pin in it here and again. But the point is that they too want the baby to be the best baby it can be. They may have a different vision, but sometimes, and if they do, sometimes it's a more accurate vision. I had that happen with a book. I was just blown away. The editor had a clearer idea of what I was about than I did myself on that book. I was distracted by the beautiful digressions that I'd introduced, and she saw the whole thing as a constant entity. It was very moving, actually. Human beings are always riddled with doubt, except the monstrous ones, probably. So there's no way around that. You just have to learn to live with it. Number 4, Jetpack was yes, wants to know if there will be a third collaboration between me and Stephen King. Jetpack was yes, would love to see a sequel to Talisman Black House. Yes, I think there will be. Steve and I agreed like 3 or 4 years ago that we would, couldn't have been that long ago, well, let's say 3 years ago, that we would, in all likelihood, write a third book, the last of the Jack Sawyer novels. In a way, though, it was there from the beginning, at least the ending of Black House, because the ending of Black House opens up into another narrative altogether. The protagonist is given a wonderful but profound problem, and he will have to cope with that problem. And it practically writes another book by itself. It doesn't, I assure you, but it does kind of tell us what one of the central issues in that novel will be. I think we'll begin in a year or so. It doesn't have a title. Ranger 1 or Rang 3R1, I think that's Ranger 1, says, do you ever look back at anything you've published and think, I really should have done this a different way? How many rough drafts do you normally go through on an average when you're working on a book? I'm happy to say I've never really looked back at anything and said to myself, oh, I made a mess of this. I wish I'd done it a different way. I know writers who have done that, and it always struck me as a real curse to discover the way you should have written your book after it's written. In that case, you should have put a halt to the whole matter and gone back to the beginning. I often look and see things that I wish I could change, but that is largely a matter of word choice or style or something of that sort. And the number of rough drafts is an unanswerable question, because there are many, many, many. And I have rough drafts of the first 4 chapters, then rough drafts of the first 10 chapters, then something completely different that replaces those. So by the time I get to the end of a book, I have stacks and stacks and stacks of manuscripts, all of them turned into wiring diagrams. I like to work on hard copy. So I take a pencil and I cross things out and I write things in. And then I work from that to make another clean page or another clean manuscript. But that process goes on from the beginning to the end. So how many drafts? Maybe 10, maybe 15, something like that. Now, number 6, Nigerian Prince, one of the best handles I've seen here, says, what advice would you give young authors starting out? How do you deal with writer's block? I think I've sort of dealt with the advice issue, which is read a hell of a lot. Just read, starting yesterday, read everything you can, because you want to get as much narrative inside you as you possibly can, so that you know strategies. You can see how other people have done things. A, you won't invent the wheel, and B, you won't be as stumped as you would be otherwise. Writer's block is a matter that I always thought was a complete delusion, a pretension. I thought of writers whose whole career was spent being blocked, and it struck me as laughably con man-like. There was a writer named Bowden Broadwater who was married to Mary McCarthy once, and everybody felt sorry for Bowden. He was a handsome, well-off guy, but he was a blocked writer. So he sat there and he looked at a piece of paper for years. I thought that was a really splendid bit of flim-flammery. And 2 years ago, I was on a panel at Marymount about writing, about writer's block. I was one of 2 men on a long panel. The women and the first man went down the line discussing how they did knitting, or they went shopping, or they did one thing after another while they suffered writer's block. And I sat there getting grumpier and grumpier. And finally, when it was my turn, I couldn't help myself. I said, I don't believe in any of this stuff you're saying. I think people invented writer's block so they wouldn't be able to write. So people like me can't have writer's block. We're not allowed to have it. We just go to work. If it's difficult, you just work anyway. So I said I didn't believe in writer's block. The next day, the god of writing took umbrage and struck me down. So I couldn't think of a thing. I looked inside of that place where writing comes from, and the door was closed. The door stayed closed almost a year. I couldn't get anything done because I had offended the god of writing. So I would say, when you have writer's block, just suffer through it. It'll end. I hope it won't last a year. At least I don't think it's a joke anymore. Number 7, USR. I really love Ghost Story. Are there any plans to remake the Ghost Story movie or adapt more of your novels into movies? Every writer, especially writers of fiction, just expire with delight at the thought of their novels being turned into movies. I have various options out. It's always possible some will come through. There 1 or 2 seem very promising, but the film world is beyond my comprehension. I don't understand exactly how it works, except there's a lot of people out there all saying wonderful things to one another and then going home. I don't know how they ever get anything done. I'd love to see a remake of the movie Ghost Story, because the movie of Ghost Story wasn't all that good. However, the problem is that when television programs or movies are remade, they are usually ones that were pretty successful and which people liked a lot. So it's not, Charlie's Angels may not have been a brilliant TV series, but people really liked it. So there's the same with the Mod Squad even, or Starsky and Hutch. They weren't unpopular. You don't see a movie made of 10 Speed and Brown Shoe, for example, which is just as good as those other things. But it wasn't very popular, so it'll never get made. I fear Ghost Story will languish. And at least the movie had Fred Astaire in it. That's all I can say. It wasn't so bad. It wasn't a very good movie, though. Question 8 is Deadly Aroma. What was your favorite book to write and why? That's very difficult to answer. But difficulty probably has something to do with the answer I'll give. Because I'm very tempted to say that my favorite book to write was a novel called Coco that came out in 1988. I started writing it about 1984. It took a long, long time to do. And part of the reason that I look back on it with pleasure was that it was very difficult. It was difficult in a particular way. I felt that I was in imperfect control of what I could call my instrument, that I had more range. I had more octaves once. I'd taken a year off immediately previous to this, and it seemed to me that year had erased instincts of mine that I needed. So with the feeling of swimming against the tide, I worked for a year. I wrote maybe 100 pages, working every day. The second year, I worked more happily. And by the third year, I was fully in command of everything I'd ever had. And in fact, I felt as though I'd raised my game. And I wrote, it was about, let us say, an 800-page typescript. I probably wrote 600 pages of that the last year. And toward the end, blissfully. The angel, it seemed to me, or something, did grip my pen and write a lot of stuff for me, almost like taking dictation. When that happens, you have to do very little revision because your unconscious is so in tune with your material that everything comes out the way it's supposed to. In fact, during the writing of that book, I had the one experience that novelists most wish for, if they know it can happen, which is that of disappearing completely, of not being in this world at all, but of being in the world you have created around you. So that I, at one moment, it was like a little ecstasy. I was standing on the street where my characters had gathered. I was looking down the block. I saw them. I saw the police car. I saw everything that was in their range. And I sat there writing without being aware I was writing. Then I pulled back and I thought, wow, I'm glad that happened. I read something in which William Styron explained that had happened to him once. And so surely I was not the only person it ever happened to, but it was a great experience. Question 9 is from Batmaker. I'm not sure I understand this question. Of things related to your profession, what excites you? I guess I do understand it. What I find most exciting is what I really should find most exciting, which is the actual doing of it, the actual act of writing words on paper. I used to write by hand, and I still often do, write by hand in pencils or in fountain pens in big journals, because that is a real physical connection to the material taking form beneath me. A computer, though, is only one step removed, and it's about the same level as typewriter, except typewriters had a big physical component because it took pressure, right? Push those buttons down, and there was a big clack when the key hit the page. There were also all these mechanical difficulties surrounding typewriters. I mean, I'm not at all sorry they have, as far as I'm concerned, disappeared. But the whole question of considering prose and trying to make it sing, in a way, trying to make it as elegant, as concise, as transparent as possible, I find very exciting. Question 10 is from Anasaria. which reminds me of the name of an opera, a Swedish opera that has a science fiction theme, only that is called Aniaria, I think, by a man named Blomdahl. I once had a recording of it. It was pretty good. Anisaria wants to know, what was the biggest hurdle you had to overcome in your professional career? Probably the biggest hurdle I ever had to overcome was my own arrogance and laziness. I had to get over the fact that I thought I was good at it. I had to recognize that what was important was what came out, not me. What was important was what was finally on the page, and not me. I was an instrument. I was not of primary importance at all, and my tendency to think that because I wrote it, it had to be good was, of course, a mistake. It meant it might be good, but I needed all the help I could get to make the thing as good as it could possibly be. I didn't have the sort of problems that beginning writers almost always have, and which beginning writers these days I think always do have, which is I didn't have any trouble in getting publication. I wrote a novel. I was a graduate student living in Dublin. I was not happy in graduate school. I wrote a novel. I mailed it to a publisher in England whose list I liked, and 3 months later that publisher accepted my novel, and I was on my way. I had more trouble with the second novel than the first, but at least I had that essential validation that meant it wasn't all a fantasy. All beginning writers, or most of them, must imagine that whatever luck they have is a fluke, but one must get over that feeling and understand that it's something that emerges from your own capacities. It's not a fluke because it requires a lot of work. And now that I've answered these questions, there's something I am curious about a bit, because it occupies a good deal of my time when not spent actually writing. Well, what I wonder about is if your community can see anything interesting happening in the world of what is called horror. Because I think I can. I edited a big anthology for the Library of America last year. It was called The American Fantastic Tale, in 2 volumes, 80-odd stories. The whole second half of the second volume consisted of stories that had been written from 2000 through till about 2009 or 2008. So that's 20-odd stories. Those stories, to me, at least the best ones, were indistinguishable from the kind of stories you find in the New Yorker or the Atlantic or Harper's or Conjunctions, good journals and good quarterlies. I find this wholly positive, and I wonder if you do too. What's positive about it, to me, is that horror is the one genre that's closest to general literature. I think it's the one that's least defined by its generic components, because in horror those components are very, very fluid. They're not fixed. In crime fiction, there must be a murder. There must be a central crime. There has to be a detective. There have to be clues or something of that sort. Horror is so vague. It's supernatural. It's psychological, or it's atmospheric. I wonder if you can see these boundaries dissolving. The dissolution of those boundaries is some of the best news I've ever had in my life. It drives some people crazy on both sides of the gap. Some horror writers refuse to give up their identity as an embattled, grubby minority. It's delightful to have an outsider role. It's very ripe and very rich to be cast as a despised outsider. You can't lose in that role. Everything you say is the truth if you have that role. But it's also sometimes of more value, I think, if to be invited into the house, even as a rather dubious guest. So what I wonder, and I don't know if I'll ever find out the answer, is if some of the rest of you feel the same way. Thank you.